Can you hear me out there? Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. You're in for such a wonderful treat, which I'm sure you have already gathered if you were already on the march, led by Dallas. And I'm here simply to introduce Dallas Gudgell, who you probably know is from the flyers and so on, is a social activist, environmentalist. He's done a lot of important work in our communities in a number of ways, and I'm going to just keep it very short, and let's give a very warm round of applause to Dallas Gudgell.
You're all very beautiful. A little mass of humanity kind of makes my heart feel good. I like that. I'm really honored to be here today to talk with you. And, anytime that I can spend an hour and a half talking about climate change, I'm all about it. I'm there. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to talk for an hour and a half. But I am honored to be here, and I really appreciate it. I appreciated the march. It was fun to get out, get our blood moving, be in the cold, and share some chants and share some humanity. You all have picked a pretty great school here. This is a fine institution. Let's see, 17% international students, 16% Latinos, approaching 30%. That's pretty cool. I really like that. I like the international population. Thank you all. Top ratings in USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, Kiplinger's, Wall Street Journal gave you the #1 rating of the colleges in Idaho. So this is pretty cool. 3 governors and 7 Rhodes Scholars were produced by College of Idaho. So that's really great. This is awesome. I really appreciate being here. So I'm just going to get right into it. So the arc of justice, the moral arc of the universe, is it just? I believe that Dr. King would say, maybe not without our help. And that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. We want to honor Dr. King. He's a lifelong legacy. And the reason why I say that maybe he would say not without our help, it's evidenced by his lifelong effort to inspire and to organize people on human rights and on civil rights. Dr. King just didn't sit down and wait for the arc of justice to bend, or the arc of the universe to bend toward justice. He was working at it every day of his life. He would kind of pull and tug, kind of bring that arc back into line with justice. So today, that's what I'm here to ask you to do. I'm asking you to help with that, keep tugging on that arc so that we can bring it back into justice. The civil rights movement of Dr. King's era lasted about 20 years and ended in the late 1960s, ostensibly with his death, with his assassination. Here's a quote, that quote: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Dr. Martin Luther King. That was a speech given at the National Cathedral on March 31st, 1968. That was 5 days before he was assassinated. So who's to say that opinion about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, who's to say that that's wrong? Not me. Delivering a speech in Martin Luther King's time wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for him to get up here and give addresses. And he did give about 450 addresses over a 10-year period. Inspiring leaders to favor justice and equity is not easy. Remaining positive in the face of oppression, that's not easy. Inspiring others to keep hope in the face of setbacks is not easy. It was not easy for Dr. King. Delivering an address today is not easy as well. Inspiring others to act with justice and equity, inspiring our leaders to act with justice and equity, remaining positive in the face of oppression and injustice, inspiring others to keep hope in the face of setbacks. That's not easy. Tomorrow, a 28-year tradition of celebrating Dr. King has been canceled in Virginia because of credible threats of violence. And that's part of the time we're in. So how do we honor Dr. King and his life's work when it so often feels like not a lot has changed? So how is today's narrative changed? Perhaps what is just is a little bit more visible, yet just actions and practice in today's world are not, on their own, bending towards justice. So let's talk a little bit about today's narrative. Today's narrative must talk about white privilege and the automatic advantage and access that comes with white privilege. Today's narrative must talk about the power that comes with privilege, and often that power is used as power over. Today's narrative must talk about white fragility, and at best, the difficulty that the defensiveness of white fragility creates around any meaningful dialogue around race. White fragility at its worst simply and aggressively demonizes the other. And beware, in today's world, even if you have white skin, you may easily become the other. Today's narrative must talk about systemic racism and institutional racism, and the blind spot these systemic institutional structures create for all of us when considering solutions for racism and considering situations of race relations. Ally is an old term, a safe but inadequate concept. The new narrative of today denies allies. Ethnic communities do not need allies. When it comes to race, the word ally sets up a passive cheering section, but none of the heavy lifting. Today's narrative has no middle ground. I see race relations today as racist or anti-racist. There's no comfortable middle ground, no place for a passive ally. There is racism, and there is active anti-racism. That's it. As Dr. King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends, Dr. King. For me, this statement says there is racism, both passive and active, and we know what that looks like. And then there is the active act of being an anti-racist. We are all oppressed and privileged in multiple, various different ways. It's very complex. Privilege and power over is a messy thing. If race relations were to be framed just with individuals, perhaps many individuals would identify and see only our character. But that's not how it is. Racism is an institutional infrastructure. It's not enough to be neutral. There's no middle ground in race relations. Each individual must choose. You're going to be racist, whether that's passive or active, or you're going to be an anti-racist. And that's what we're looking for, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. There's no non-race category anymore. Non-racist category. If I'm to recognize my male privilege, I must work and practice at my male privilege on a daily basis. Because of my male privilege, I don't have to think about gender issues. I don't have to think about these complicated things with gender. So as a male with male privilege, I have to think about being an anti-sexist every day, and I have to practice it. I'm obligated, because of that privilege, to see my blind spot and to practice anti-sexism. I have many of my white friends that will say, "Dallas, you're always talking about race. It makes me feel like you're racist against white people." And I say, it's impossible for me to be racist against white people. Because of my indigenous background, I'm at a disadvantage automatically. While white skin in today's world is an automatic advantage and often has power over me. Or I have a lot of white friends that will say, "Dallas, why do you always talk about race?" Similar question, because I'm always bringing it up. The answer to that question lies in the question. I always talk about race because you don't have to. You have the power and the privilege and the luxury of not thinking about race because race benefits you. It benefits you in a positive way. When you begin to talk about race on a daily basis, when you begin to take action, an active role in being an anti-racist, then I wouldn't have to bring up race all of the time. If we are to judge each other only by our content of our character, we must dismantle years of institutional racism and institutional sexism. Dismantle years of systemic thinking. Racism has been going on for so long, it is programmed into our DNA. We can unprogram it from our DNA, but we have to do it consciously on a daily basis. Our children will have to do it consciously on a daily basis, and their children, perhaps in that third generation, will have the racism unprogrammed from their DNA. But that's what we have to do. We have to look at it in those terms. Quote, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetrate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." Dr. Martin Luther King. That said, much of this work is yet to be done. The majority of this work that's yet to be done needs to be done within and by dominant, privileged culture, whether that's white, male, affluent, educated, socially acceptable classes. That's where the work lies. If you are in any of these classes or categories, and you are passive in the face of evil, you are helping the perpetrator. Nobody's mad at you for being white. Just as nobody should be mad at me for being Native American. But some are. In some cases, many are. So it's not enough to recognize one's privilege and its associated institutional advantage. That's passive racism. Just as by me recognizing my male privilege and the advantages that that privilege has, I would be participating in passive sexism. No one is asking white skin to apologize for their ancestors or white skin. I am asking you to, with me, join with me and dismantle systems of oppression that are currently in place. I'm asking you to recognize these systems of automatically benefit you and oppress me. Dr. King's dream was not limited to race relations. Dr. King promoted world peace, deplored violence, and was a champion for the poor. Dr. King supported sanitation workers and worked to give them better working conditions. The march that Dr. King was to lead, on Tuesday, 5 days after he was assassinated, was for the Poor People's Campaign. It's important to point out that Dr. King's work was not solely on race injustices. It was about all injustices of the time. There are many injustices that I see today. I also see huge resistance to these injustices. When I look around the world, I see democracy in crisis. I'm not going to qualify that statement about democracy being in crisis. I think that's a different talk. But I'm going to say that I do see democracy in crisis around the world. For me, it's time for the two-leggeds to see ourselves as global citizens. I just want to point to a couple of these injustices. Climate change. I said I wasn't going to talk for an hour and a half about climate change, but it's worth mentioning. Climate change around the world is led by indigenous people. Excuse me, let me start over. Indigenous people around the world are leading this movement on climate change. One of the reasons why I think that they are part of the leaders of this is that climate change is an environmental justice issue. Studies show those who suffer first and the most from climate change are people of color around the world. These people are called climate refugees. Not all of these refugees are people of color, but the majority of them are. There are 21 million estimated climate refugees today, and by 2050, there's an estimate that there will be 150 to 200 million climate refugees. Indigenous people, like I said, are leading that movement. Indigenous people around the world are the leaders, as I see it, when it comes to community, the earth, and climate change. And it's no coincidence that we see a lot of these leaders around the world that are indigenous women. I see a lot of hope in our indigenous leaders around the world. I see a lot of hope in our women leaders around the world, and there are a lot of them. That's probably a different talk too, but I'm noticing that there is this trend of a lot of women leaders, and they're doing what I consider to be the right thing. Sports mascots. Don't get me started on sports mascots. The debate about sports mascots is so absurd. The idea of hanging on to a mascot that is clearly offensive to a modern race, because, well, that's the way we've always done it, is absurd. This thinking is so obtuse, I rarely enter this debate. Just change the mascots. So here I am. I'm standing before you as a Native American, and I don't want to see a comic caricature of me. Here, I'll show you. This is what a brave looks like. This is what a chief looks like. I have a decent profile for that. I'm right here. I don't need a comic caricature. And so that's all I have to say about mascots, is just change them. Done. Thanks. Next. Another quote. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged by the where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And that is a very famous Dr. King quote. And that was given on August 28th, 1963, on the March on Washington, another really big event in that movement for civil rights. Oh, and by the way, just so you know, go Yotes. I'm okay with charismatic megafauna as mascots. Just not my profile. That was out of context. But, so this dream of having the world judge us by the content of our character, it's a good dream, and this dream is possible. And to make this dream happen, I think, going back to the beginning, I think we have to help that moral arc of justice, or that moral arc, the universe's moral arc, bend towards justice. We have to help it. Because we're not there yet. Dr. King turned that moral arc towards justice in that civil rights movement, and we now must all continue to do our part to continue to bend that moral arc of the universe towards justice. So how do we make this dream come true? I want to leave with hopefully some just concrete ideas about how to do it. So how do we get there? To get there, we must call out racism. Not now. Soon. When I say we, I don't just mean people of color need to be doing that. I mean white people and people of color. Together, we need to be calling these things out. To get there, we need to call out privilege. To get there, we need to call out power and power over. To get there, we need to call out passive racism. To get there, we need to call out demonizing the other. That seems to be really popular on social media. And I get a little frustrated with that. Seems what's working is lies and cheating and demonizing the other on social media. So we do need to call that out. To get there, we need to call out xenophobia. To get there, we need to call out homophobia. To get there, we need to call out bigotry. To get there, we need to call out biocentricity. To get there, we need to call out ecocentricity. To get there, all people of all colors, we must call out racism. To get there, all people of all colors must call out white fragility. We are all a victim of this years-long DNA programming of racism. To unprogram, I have some ideas. If you are white, make room for a person of color to speak. If you are white, understand that privilege has automatically opened doors for you. If you are white, you need not be defensive when your whiteness is pointed out. If you are white, advocate for changing the mascots. If you are a person of color, own your place at the table. If you are a person of color, honor your value. If you're a person of color, don't apologize for your background or your climb. If you are a person of color, believe that you're good enough. If you're a man, make room for a woman to speak. If you're a man, understand that your privilege has opened doors for you. If you're a man, you need not be defensive when your maleness is pointed out. If you're a woman, honor your spot at the table. And own it. If you're a woman, honor your value. If you're a woman, don't apologize for your background and your climb. If you're a woman, believe you're good enough. What else can we do? Look for ways to expose yourself to other races you're not familiar with, races you're afraid of. There's literally hundreds of ways to expose yourself to other races. Learn about these other races. This is the important self-education that will work to end racism. Be uncomfortable. Sit with your uncomfortableness about race. Heaven knows that people of color have been uncomfortable in many situations for many years. Read the news. Don't just watch the news. Don't just look at your Facebook feed, but actually read the articles daily, weekly. The Washington Post and the New York Times and many other reputable journal agencies have stories on race. Most of them are pretty good. Read books. Read any book by a person of color. You can read a book a week for a year written by a woman of color. Google it, you'll find it. Read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Pay particular close attention to chapter 23. Okay, so I'm just about to wrap it up. One more quote. We need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The place I go for hope when I feel despair is this Dr. King quote. Hatred paralyzes life. Love replaces it. Releases it. Let me start over. Hatred paralyzes life. Love releases it. Hatred confuses life. Love harmonizes it. Hatred darkens life. Love illuminates it. I thank you all, and I'll be here all week. But I will ask, if there's questions, I'm totally open to that. Nobody has any questions? Some of you are here for class. You're supposed to ask questions. The question was, do I think that we can really get everyone to care about everyone in the world? I'm one of those eternal optimists that believes it's possible. I believe in humanity, and I believe in the goodness of humanity, and I do believe that that's possible. I think it's the fear of the unknown, it's the fear of the other, and it's easy to demonize the other, and that's kind of what's happening right now. George Carlin. I always think of this thing with George Carlin. He had this great idea, right? He said, all we do is just form two lines, and then we just pass in these two lines, all 7.7 billion of us, and we shake hands. And then at that point, we kind of have to like one another. It's like, well, I can't be mean to her. I know that woman. I can't kill him. I know that guy. And that was George Carlin's take on it. Now, I get that logistically that's impossible, but I think that that's what I'm saying when I say, learn about another race. You know, I went to a mosque for the first time. I'm 60 years old. I was 9 years old when Dr. King was assassinated. So after 60 years, I went to my first mosque a couple of weeks ago. It was awesome. I loved it. It was great. That's what I'm talking about. The best ways to advocate for the voices of reservation natives. So this is a hard one for me because I am super sensitive to cultural appropriation and spiritual appropriation. And so it's really hard to, and I'm, because of that sensitivity, I'm kind of not very nice about it some of the time, and that doesn't help, right? I mean, people, they know that about me, and they're like, I don't want to talk to you because you're just being mean. And it might be true. But also, that distrust was built on a pretty valid genocide. So there's a reason for that. So it's my work is to begin to trust. Okay, so that's my work. And I don't want to get into the oppression Olympics, but reservations are the poorest of the poor in a rich country. And it may not be completely true, because there's a lot of other poor places in the South. Poverty is a whole nother speech. And Dr. King was about to make that speech, shortly, but he died first. I think things like the mascots, like kind of just learning, not being paternal. There's a lot of, when I left my reservation in 1986, I was an environmental scientist for my tribe. When I left, I was probably one of the only people in my tribe that had a higher degree. And now we have doctors and lawyers and attorneys and judges, and it's awesome. We don't need to be patronized anymore. We just need that anti-racist voice. So yeah, I have male privilege. I can exercise power over women if I chose to. It's just an institutional structure that's in place that allows me to do that. It's a bummer, yeah, it's the right thing to do, to give that power up. And the reason why, so your question was why sacrifice that power? Right? Because it is the right thing to do. Yes, you're right. But one of the things is that we're kind of all bought into the big lie that power is finite. It's not. It's infinite. So I'm going to give up all that power of being a male. I'm going to just give it up because it's just going to come back to me in spades, and I'm just going to, it's infinite, so I don't really need it. Does that help? Or is it too nebulous? Oh, why is it hard? Oh, I think it's both fear and ego, like really bad combinations of that. Yeah, I mean, I think as two-leggeds we've become pretty self-important. And Native cultures, not just North American Native cultures, but Native cultures, I grew up in a culture that it was just a cultural thing. We weren't self-important. We were just as important as things with roots, things with fins, things with wings, things with that creep and crawl. They're all of our brothers and sisters. Matakaya oyase, that means all of our relations. And that is all of those things that live, including stones, the stone tribe, the rock people. So I kind of grew up in a culture that wasn't really self-important. And that was a cool place to grow up. What's a mascot that is bad? A mascot that is bad is a mascot that makes fun of me, because I'm here, I'm alive, I'm living, I'm not an ancient, I don't know. So it's making fun of something that's contemporary and alive, and giving, kind of feels like it's making fun of me. So, like I say, animals, bears, coyotes, lions, those things are all great mascots, just not people. All right, Garen? I was hoping that somebody would answer that question because it's a really hard one to answer. The question was, why do I believe there's no middle ground? Why is it racist or anti-racist? And there's no like, just kind of like passive, I'm just a non-racist. And the reason I think that is because that term of allies does not have the people that have the power and have the privilege. It does not give them the work to be done. There was one of the presidential candidates, Gippard, I think was her name, I don't remember. She got it. She got that. When I heard her talk, she got that. The work was her work. She had to do it with herself as a white person and then with her white community. That was where the work was. And that's how I feel that there isn't any middle ground anymore. So that's a good question, and it is a hard one to answer, because it would be nice to just kind of like, I don't really want to get in that because it's kind of messy, and but that's the thing, was we got to get in there and do some of this messy work as individuals. So I think I had another way of answering that, but if I think of it, I'll get back to it. Okay, the question was, would I tell about a time when I called someone out and then when someone called me out? I used to do a lot of diversity, cultural competency and diversity training around the Pacific Northwest and in DC. And I thought I knew it all, right? I was probably 30 years younger, and I knew everything I needed to know about race relations and gender issues. And I was trying to figure out which one I should do first. So I was working with a group in DC, a nuclear disarmament group. And I was doing this great diversity training, and it was all about race, and I was really on top of it, and I knew what was going on. And then I like mansplained something. And I totally got called out right there. It's like, and it took me a minute. Like, this is that blind spot I'm talking about. I was like, It took me a minute to get it. And I was like, and then she had to explain it again, and I felt, and now I get why I have to explain it over and over as a race person. She had to explain it again, and then finally the light clicked, and I was like, oh, I did that thing that I'm not supposed to do. I totally get it now. Excuse me. So that was the time when I got called out. While I was a trainer in a room full of, really progressive activists. And then, like, the scary part is, while I was working for Colorado Peace Action, I just got on the bus, down there at Larimer Square, and it goes up and down. And there was a group that came on, and there was 1 or 2 women with the group and 4 or 5 men. And they were just being totally rude. And I could probably do this every day, but I don't because it's super scary. They were just being rude, and they were saying things that were offensive to me. And rather than being an ally and like trying to protect the woman, I had gotten it by then. I knew which things to not do, and I just said, "That's offending me. I need you to stop." And so that's another one of those cases where I was able to call someone else out. Okay, so I'm going to paraphrase it. So, any tips for trying to do the work as a white person around race that doesn't overpower or take away from people of color? And you're also a woman, and so you also have a disadvantage in that as well, because men have power and privilege as part of our culture. So in Michelle Obama's book, there's many examples of this, and I do recommend that. But it is a fine line. And like you say, if you're talking to me about Native American things and I think that you might be doing some cultural or spiritual appropriation, I might make you feel bad. and that would be a bummer, but I might. And that would be and not necessarily wrong on my part unless I overdid it. But if you're, as a white person at the table with people of color, I've asked them to own their spot at the table, and you as a woman own your spot at the table. And in those situations, I think, follow your heart, because I guess what I've noticed is that the sincerity and coming from the place of heart is what is most effective in those things. And there's a lot of cultures, like at least like mine, like we don't have to be heard a lot of the time. There's a lot of cultures who do have to be heard. And so that's why I say take a step back and let other people be heard sometimes. I don't know. That's a really great question, because that fine line, that balance, is really hard. And when I took away the idea that you could be an ally, that made it even harder. Right? I love that question, and I don't have a good answer. The question is why do we have to label? Why do we have to separate? Why do we have to put people in boxes? Gender, race, ethnic or religion, different ways of identifying with sexual orientation. Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to separate that all out? The reason is because of the systemic institutional framework that's in place. Because there's no way to dismantle that just as a big group. We have to call out each thing and each, in order to dismantle that, which is what I'm asking us to do, dismantle that infrastructure of systemic institutional racism, we have to get to the place of being able to identify our differences. We can't just march in there as one and say, hey, we're ready to stop doing this. I think we have to identify our differences, and when we do that, if we do it in a meaningful, honest, truth and reconciliation type way, we have to do our own work. It's not just a matter of forgiveness. It's a matter of real truth and reconciliation with the past and bringing everything forward. And then, if we get down to a level playing field, then we can all hug and take this on. So that's my daughter. She's Yankton, Dakota. She did not grow up on a reservation, but I did. And so, so apparently there was a boy who called her savage. And the reason why Andrea is that savage is a negative term that is often a label for Native Americans. And so both my son and my daughter are up there, and we do a lot of powwows, and we dance. They dance. They go to powwows and their regalia, and they participate. And so they're very aware of their heritage, their nationality, their Dakota-ness. And so Andrew, I called him out because, well, one, I was probably a little upset. Two, it was an educational moment, even for your fifth grade buddy or whoever it was. I don't know what grade that was in. I don't have a memory of it. But I was just letting him know. It's like, that's a term that we don't want to use because it labels Native Americans in a negative way. Okay. That's a really great question. So in my 60 years, have I noticed any changes in race relations? And like I said, so I do remember when Kennedy was assassinated. I was probably 7, 8, or 9, and the house just went quiet for like 3 days. And the house went immediately quiet the day he was assassinated. And And I didn't really get what was going on. And like I said, when Dr. King was assassinated, I was 9. But because I grew up on an Indian reservation, and I have been around, and I have seen a lot, and I've done a lot of work on race over the last 40, 45 years, really. And have I seen a lot of change? Sadly, not a lot. I mean, it's like, okay, well, Dallas, we had a black president. And I'm like, yeah, and that is super awesome, and I loved him. But we're kind of, the pendulum, after that president left office, the pendulum kind of swung way to the other side. In maybe response to that, because of the racist institution of Washington, D.C. And so that is a culture that, like, I used to lobby there, but have you ever, I mean, I'd recommend you go and do some citizen lobbying in Washington, D.C. It's a scary, evil place in a lot of ways, but that's where our laws are made. And I don't mean evil like we can't change it. I think there's a lot of really good people there. But the infrastructure, the systemic and institutional racism is really, 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 really ingrained in D.C. I mean, more so than anywhere else I think I've worked. And so that's hard, because we can march and we can get together, and from the grassroots up, we can make a lot of changes. But to penetrate that bubble of the Beltway, of inside the Beltway, is a really hard thing to do. Unless you're AIM and you take over the BIA building for 8 days, AIM, American Indian Movement, or you take over Alcatraz for a long period of time, then you get some coverage. But that still didn't change a lot. I'm wearing red, a red hair tie and a red shirt for, all these indigenous women that are dying and being trafficked and missing, and it's hard. It's a hard time. That's a good question. Should Latin American descendants, people, claim indigenous identity? Yes, most certainly, I believe. We were all tribal at some point. I mean, I'm part Scottish. I'm a mutt, really. I've got Scottish ancestry and English ancestry. My grandmother was Assiniboine. My grandfather was Yankton, Dakota. I'm kind of a mix. But I definitely identify with Tienos, that indigenous culture. I think that it's important, because when I say that the movement, so Australia's on fire, South America's on fire, who's leading all of the movements and the resistance to the governments that are not doing the right thing around climate change and community and the earth? They're indigenous people, and I think that Latin America was also indigenous, and claiming that is a good thing. Because part of this, for me, as a North American native, I'm connected to a spot on the earth. And historically, genetic memory is connecting anyone who is, whether you're Celtic or South American or Australian, we're all connected to a place on the earth physically. And so, I haven't been back to, lived on my reservation for over 35 years, but I'm still connected to that spot. The tribes of Idaho, they'll tell you all about this valley. They know everything about it. They've been here for thousands of years. Okay, so I'm going to paraphrase, but is there a situation of in-house racism or black on black or Native American on Native American? And is there a way to resolve it? But the backstory on that is there's an immigration issue, essentially. Anybody familiar with immigration issues in this country? So first of all, in Indian country, when I'm doing diversity training or work in just getting along. It's hardest in my own culture, in Indian country. There's 500 different tribes in the U.S. that are indigenous. They speak 500 different languages. They live on 360 Indian reservations around the country. Like I said, most of them are very impoverished unless they have a casino. And it's hard that even in my indigenous relatives have bought into that lie, that power is finite. And they're not often willing to cooperate. And so I have that struggle. I've done work with tribes in Nevada when they're trying to protect their land and the Nevada test site, which is where nuclear weapons were tested. And there's 3 or 4 or 5 different tribes there, and they can't really get along and figure out a game plan to do the protest. And it's a little frustrating for me. So I get what you're saying, and so yes, I think there is sometimes some in-house jealousy or bickering or fear of that the power is finite instead of infinite. And then it seems like there's also that other immigration issue. And I don't know, I can't speak to your country, but I know in this country, I used to know a lot about the military budget, but essentially it's still 65% of your tax dollars. And if we even reduce that by 10% of its current budget, we'd have plenty of room and plenty of jobs and plenty of services for anybody who might want to immigrate to this country. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of, and I don't know what your situation is in your country. Is it close? I can see infighting, but I can also see maybe there's a way to welcome those people if they're trying to just get a better life. So if we didn't see race, you wouldn't be put in that box. We see race, we see skin color, and that's probably not going to go away. But with I think some of this type of education and taking a look at other races, I mean, I think there's some people that you're just not going to change, but I think there are some people that are, like, sometimes even I don't know what to say, and I've been doing this stuff for a long time. And so it was like this question over here, how do you, ask the right question? And I can tell you from a Native American standpoint, what do you like to be called? Well, 10 years ago, I used to like to be called Native American. Now I'd prefer First Nations. And so it changes too. I like the idea of just educating someone when they ask. It's like, do you speak African? I'd prefer that you ask, what language do I speak? And you probably speak 2 or 3 languages, maybe. I'm guessing. maybe more. And so I think that's where we have to start. Sometimes we have to start just that basic. It's like, that's really not a fair question. And a better question would be, how about, you can see that I'm black. You're trying to figure out where I come from. I'm not going to go back there because I'm going to school, so don't ask me that. But you could ask me, what language do I speak? Or, do you have brothers and sisters? Just that's where we got to get to, that place. And I don't know, and your question is, how do we do that? And I don't know. I think we just have to do it one person at a time. So the question was, there's been a lot of voices that have been lost because of institutional racism. And how do we recover some of that history? That's a really good question. So So I don't speak Dakota. I can understand Dakota. The reason I don't speak Dakota is because my grandmother and my grandfather were sent to boarding schools. Anybody hear of Standing Rock, the water protectors? Well, that's where my grandfather at Fort Yates went to boarding school. So the language was beaten out of him and my grandmother. And so my grandfather, all of us grandkids, please teach us Dakota. And he's like, oh, that language will never do you any good. And so what has happened on my reservation, now there are some reservations that do speak Dakota or Lakota, and what has had to happen on my reservation is that the elders who did speak it, they went into the schools and started teaching it again. So we have huge language programs on my reservation now. And so that is something, that is one way that things can be recovered. And I think language is important, and that connection to place is important. And I think that those stories, my culture, we don't have anything there. It was mostly passed down through stories. We don't have a written language. We do now because we're trying to teach Dakota and Lakota, but it was passed down through stories. So I think collecting those stories is a good thing. So the question was, how is trust? It's a big question, because the question is, how has trust changed over time, essentially? And I was just talking to another parent about this not too long ago. It's like, I'd go out and we'd play kick the can till 10, 11 at night, and but it was a small community. And so Garen is wondering, well, now I can't even cross the street. And I think that in some ways, things are safer, but I think we're more paranoid. And so I think that there are some of us who are helicopter parents because we're more paranoid, and we don't trust. But in some ways, I think that the actual safety issues in many places is not really changed. But I do think that we're less trusting. And I don't know, it sounded like you started out asking, how do we trust in our government? But kind of diverted into, how come I can't go to the park? And I was going to answer, do we trust in our government? And I think Mark Twain had it best. Love your country always, your government only when it deserves it. Right. So French, Canadian, English, people with black skin. So that's a hard one. So the question was, because of black skin, because of skin color, she's put in a particular box. She's probably not from anywhere near Africa, apparently. And so we're put into this box. It's funny, it's like, people tend to give me thoughts I've never had. And you're put into a box that doesn't really exist. Or you're put into some other box, and your box isn't even recognized as a box. And that's another hard one. It's like, so now, you're black and you're from Montreal, and they want you to be from Africa because that's how they're going to deal with you. And it's their thinking that needs to be changed, and that's why I'm saying it's like that's where we need to do that individual work. I don't know how we tear down those boxes that, I don't know, it's hard. And I don't know how to answer that question because, like I said, it makes total sense. You're put into a box that you don't belong in, for one. And I think maybe it's just part of that owning your spot at the table no matter what. I don't know. If you're just there and you're just solid, I'm not from Africa. Yes, I have black skin. Can we move on? I mean, maybe that's it.